So the Iceberg trend has been going on for a little while now, and it seems like nearly every single series on Earth has gotten one. I mean, if some idiot can come up with one for Darling in the Franxx, surely Sailor Moon has one. And to my shock, there's not a lot of them floating around. So let's try to remedy that, shall we? For those of you none of the know-how, Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon is a manga series created by Naoko Takeuchi, and it's pretty much one of the best-selling manga of all time, so you probably already knew that. And I suppose the concept of a theory iceberg doesn't need much introduction either. The top being common knowledge amongst the fandom, and we gradually dive deeper into obscurity and madness. So I'll be your host Simpai, and this is the Sailor Moon Iceberg. Before we get started, I'd like to address a few things. Before I started working on this video, there's 3 other Sailor Moon icebergs, and none of them were really up to my standard. So the iceberg that I'm presenting is entirely made by myself. While doing research for this video, I found a blog, which proved to be invaluable with research. The blog is called Tuxedo Unmasked, and I wanted to give them proper credit within the video and in the description below. If you are a hardcore Sailor Moon fan like I am, I strongly urge you check them out. They almost make this video redundant. And while you're taking a look through their blog, please make sure to comment your favorite Sailor Senshi. Mine's Venus, and I'm willing to die on that hill. Without further ado, let's get into this iceberg. Starting at the top of the iceberg, we're gonna start with some of the more basic Sailor Moon trivia and lore. You know, just enough to get her feet wet on the subject. Starting, of course, with the series that launched Sailor Moon, codenamed Sailor V. As the title may suggest, this story is centered solely around Sailor Venus. While originally debuted as a one-shot standalone story, it enjoyed healthy success, and is actually a fantastic read if you ever have the time. It tends to be a lot more comical than the Sailor Moon manga, and deep down I still hope it gets an anime adaptation one of these days. Listen, a guy can hope, okay? Next up, we're gonna talk about Neptune and Uranus. Yeah, everybody knows where I'm going with this, but where the hell were they in the Black Moon arc? We know they're around at the time, but, like, really, what the hell were they doing? And that bit's gone on long enough. Neptune and Uranus are probably the second best power couple in the series, second in only to Chibiusa and Pegasus. I'm old enough to remember the whole cousin debacle, and since Sailor Alabama's not a thing, and they weren't really hiding it in the anime, Haruka and Michiru's relationship remains one of the purposefully obscured yet everybody knows factoids of Sailor Moon that gives it a rather high up spot at the top of the iceberg. Next up we have Sailor Says. This is another one of those weird dub things, but for some reason they decided to add a PSA at the end of every episode of Sailor Moon. These things are actually a riot to watch. We're talking super low effort here. Reused footage. I think everything was done in a single take. Words can't even describe it accurately. Just watch.
Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is believing in yourself. Especially when your grades are less than stellar. Or you're kind of clumsy. But you never know what the real you can do. Set your mind and heart on it, and anything is possible. Bye now.
Going from one strange topic to a completely different strange topic, I want to talk about the Sailor Moon musicals. Now, I read a synopsis for every single one of these, and I'm still confused. There are over 31 different musicals. Like most adaptations, they tend to stick pretty close to the source material. That is, until they don't. We got vampires, we got Cain and Abel, 50 different people with the name Dark. If you thought the main series was weird, this is even weirder. My brain actually hurts thinking about the plot to some of these. I could honestly go on all day about how strange these things are, but I'm just gonna move on to something even stranger, Saban Moon. Now, Saban is an interesting company, and today they're probably best known for their heavy involvement with the Power Ranger series. And you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with Sailor Moon? And the answer to that is absolutely nothing, as despite the fan name of Saban Moon, Saban had absolutely nothing to do with this production, which would have been a strange, Americanized, half cartoon, half live action retelling of Sailor Moon. Suffice to say, we live in a blessed timeline where this never came to fruition. It honestly looks like an episode of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show or something, so I think we can all be thankful this never came to exist. Last but not least, we have the concept of Sailor Earth. Back in the day, you used to hear a lot of rumblings about this. There was a whole bunch of different theories about the possibility of a Sailor Earth, and the rumor mill around this still exists to some degree, with a whole bunch of people claiming that Naru was supposed to be Sailor Earth, and that she was supposed to have a more important role than she ultimately ended up having. But the reason why this is so high up at the top of the iceberg is because of how simple the answer actually is. Because it's staring you right in the face. The entire series. It's Tuxedo Mask for all intents and purposes. The name Mamoru Chiba literally translates to Protector of Earth. Now that we're reaching the tip of the iceberg, I want to start with an interesting one. Sailor Satan, which is just a mistranslation of Sailor Saturn. And that mistranslation was like from the Portuguese or Polish translation. But it kind of fits in a weird way. But moving on to something I find far more interesting, we're going to talk about the real-life planet Nemesis. Now, for some reason, there's a whole bunch of theories about extra planets in our solar system. And as it just so happens, a planet called Nemesis is one of them. However, there's more to it than just that, as this theory ties directly into Sailor Moon, as it served as a sort of pseudo-inspiration for the planet of the same name, where Death Phantom was banished. Apart from just having a similar naming motif, both versions of Nemesis tend to disappear for extended periods of time, and re-emerge to cause great devastation. The real-life Nemesis is allegedly part of a mass cycle of extinction, whereas in Sailor Moon, the planet itself is made out of the evil black crystal, which is how Crystal Tokyo got destroyed. Moving on, I'd like to talk about the Sailor Wars, as it's actually a pretty interesting topic, as it actually leaves a lot of interesting lore just on the table. Essentially what the Sailor Wars are, as the name suggests, a giant war that has been raging since the dawn of time, against the eternal enemy, the ultimate evil, Chaos. What's so interesting about the Sailor Wars is we know ultimately nothing about them, other than the fact that they were considered over once Sailor Galaxia defeated Chaos. Now that's a rather large span of time. That ultimately boils down to some cool stuff happened off screen, deal with it. Is it possible that Queen Serenity was around? Ultimately, I don't think we'll ever know. This next topic, while not obscure, is certainly one that has been fiercely debated over the years. And it has to do with the series' iconic Magic Girl transformations. Just where do they take place? Are they instantaneous? Do they take place in some other dimension? Do they just occur right in front of everyone and the villain just lets them do it? You see, I was under the impression that they were instantaneous, and the whole 40-second montage was just a clever way to save on animation. But that's far too meta for this analysis, so we're left with the single question: where do these transformations take place? And there's a pretty solid case to be had for it happening in real time. And the scene with Ami and Berthier always comes to mind, due to its shift in focus from just a transformation to Berthier's face. Maybe all the dazzling lights just distract the enemy. Makes me think of that Robot Chicken sketch where they go for the really low-hanging fruit. Well, that doesn't narrow that down, does it? And another topic in a similar vein to the last. How did everybody get their names? Like, are the planets named after the Sailor Senshi? Maybe it's the inverse. So which came first, the planet or the soldier? While I am of the belief that the soldier came first, After all, scientists have yet to discover a chibi moon in our solar system. Yet, that really doesn't explain where the names came from. My initial thought was always that the Sailor crystals were named that. Not to mention that the Sailor anima mates throw that theory out the window. The Sailor starlights really don't help much either. I mean, who names a planet Star Maker? Now that I think about it, Princess Kakyo actually confuses it even more. I'm just gonna move on. Now that we're in the middle of the iceberg, things are about to get a lot more interesting. While Sailor Moon is an immensely popular franchise worldwide, I'm ashamed to admit that I know very little about it outside of its homeland of Japan, and of course North America. And this next piece of info happens to be mutually exclusive to the North American or English release. And that is, of course, the Save Our Sailors campaign, whose original website is still up, by the way. And it is the most early 2000s website I could possibly ever find. The website actually kind of hurts the eyes, but the information there is absolutely fascinating. The goal was relatively simple. Bring every episode of the original anime and dub it into English. But this is the mid-90s, early 2000s we're talking about. And no fan campaign is safe from internet drama, and for some reason, lots of Pop-Tarts were involved. You see, the year is 1996, and some people who I am assuming were children and or undercover agents for Kellogg's came up with a brilliant marketing scheme. On December 14th, 1996, everyone would go out and purchase as many Kellogg's Pop-Tarts as humanly possible. Namely, the unfrosted strawberry one. Usagi's favorite from what I've been told. I guess they called her Serena back then. And to everybody's surprise, nothing happened. Deke never finished the dub. Kellogg's never got involved with Sailor Moon. Actually, I think General Mills ended up getting involved at one point, which those idiots attributed to the purchase of some Pop-Tarts. And ultimately, the campaign ended in 2004. When the dubbing rights eventually left Deke, there's far more to the Save Our Sailors campaign, and it remains an interesting facet of Sailor Moon's history, and perhaps it warrants its own video. But that's a topic for another day. Moving on, we have Zoisite's gender changes in different regions. Now, there's two characters in Sailor Moon whose gender is often mistaken or altered for censorship purposes. I chose Zoisite because he was the first example. I know in the English dub, he was voiced and portrayed as a girl. I believe this trend also occurred in the Spanish dub, as well as several others. And it's for one really simple reason. He and Kunzite were indeed cousins. I mean romantically involved. And so Zoisite became a woman. Too stereotypical effect. Actually, the stereotype's probably worse if they left him as a gay man. The worst part about this change is that, unlike the Neptune and Uranus censorship, this one was never remedied, with some still unaware of the change ever having occurred, as the relationship doesn't exist within the manga, and thus it is absent from Crystal. Also, Venus can have a boyfriend, but Kunzite's dead, so I got a chance. Moving on, it's a commonly known factoid that men cannot be Sailor Senshi, with Naoko herself even stating as much. And this is pretty much confirmed within the continuity of the series, as we never see a male Sailor Senshi, excluding the Sailor Starlights. More on that fiasco later on. The series does a rather keen job at keeping this philosophy alive. However, that leaves Tuxedo Mask as the odd man out. Quite literally. What makes Mamoru's transformation any different than, say, Usagi's? Other than the semantics with the outfit, Mamoru technically has all the qualifications for being a magic girl, other than an X chromosome. He possesses magic, has a transformation, and even possesses a starseed. Technically speaking, for all intents and purposes, he is Sailor Earth. Now, I'm not arguing that Tuxedo Mask is actually Sailor Senshi, but merely asking what defines one. Ultimately, I don't think it was really thought out. And that's not even considering modern debate on the subject, as a lot has changed since 1998. And quite frankly, that's beyond the scope of this video. I'm just gonna kind of move on. One of the more interesting facets of the series was just how deeply entrenched toy manufacturer Bandai was in its creation, having been involved since the get-go. Unsurprisingly, the need to market and sell Sailor Moon would have been paramount for all parties involved. And according to esoteric lore passed down through old forums and GeoCities websites, the Moonstick is seemingly a creation from the necessity to sell cheap plastic toys. And evidently there's more to it than just that, as other aspects of the series were heavily tied to the merchandising machine. Bandai's first attempt at merchandising Sailor Moon was actually a play makeup set, whose influence did seep its way into the anime, as whenever one of the Sailor Senshi transform, the process always begins with the nails. All because of a product tie-in, which before starting this Iceberg, I had no clue was a thing. Shout out to Tuxedo Unmasked for uncovering that. I honestly can't have enough of that blog. So if one of the core concepts of the series was corrupted by a cheap corporate campaign, exactly how much of your childhood was decided via similar means? Could it all have been a ploy to get you to buy some cheap plastic toy? And they were cheap, trust me, I owned one of the compacts. Who's to say that the Moonstick, and then the Moon Rod, the ever-changing cast of compacts, and even Super Sailor Moon herself weren't an integral part of Naoko's vision for the series? You know, it's probably best to not think about that sort of thing. And on that note, let's talk about some video game characters, shall we? The Oppositio Senshi are, as the name implies, a group meant to be the opposite of the inner Sailor Senshi. They are a group of antagonists from the video game Sailor Moon, Another Story. And I gotta say, I love everything about these characters. If they ever did a Sailor Moon continuation story, I'd want these characters to be the antagonists. Not only do they have a really unique design, but they genuinely look like evil versions of the inner Senshi. Every one of them is named after an ancient Mesopotamian god. Suin, Nabu, Nergal, Merodach, and Ishtar. And each of them have their own correlating planet: Moon, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Venus, respectively. Now that's almost Infinity Arc levels of symbolism. In just concept alone, these characters are fantastic. And while the game was never released in English, and it's also a buggy mess, I've always wanted to play it one of these days. So let me know if you ever want to see that on the channel. Speaking of planet symbolism, if you were a strange child like I was, you may have noticed an odd disparity between Sailor Saturn and Sailor Pluto. That being that their roles are reversed. You see, the Sailor Senshi tend to take after the Greco-Roman gods quite a bit. I'd say other than astronomy, Greek myth was Naoko Takeuchi's passion. Oh, and it shows up everywhere. So why are Pluto and Saturn different? Now, when it comes to this topic, there seems to be two separate camps. One that claims that Naoko simply never planned that far ahead, and another claiming that the reversal never happened at all. I've read many, many articles from both camps. I've spent more hours on this subject than I'm willing to admit. I've lost sleep thinking about this debate, and trust me, it gets rather confusing. On the surface, what it boils down to is, simply put, Pluto is the god of the underworld, you know, an association with death. And Saturn is associated with time. So clear-cut role reversal, right? Well, that's where you're wrong, kiddo. Because Greek and Roman mythology isn't a one-way street. While it may be true that Saturn is associated with time, it's important to take note of some of Saturn's other aspects, such as being a god of agriculture and periodic renewal. Kinda like Sailor Saturn's whole gimmick. Now, when you think Greek gods, it's easy to imagine Zeus and his lightning bolts, or perhaps Poseidon and his trident. But Hades, the third brother, also has an item associated with him, that being his keys. I'm honestly not joking, look that up. While these keys usually signify great wealth, it also has minor associations with a god of time, Aeon. And since Hades is the Greek equivalent of the god Pluto, who in certain cults was known as Aeon Plutonius, who would be a keeper of keys associated with time, kinda like a certain outer Sailor Senshi. Now, I could keep rambling about different connections here or there and go really obscure into the lore of these two mythological entities, and continuously try to connect it to two fictional women created in the 1990s, but let's be honest here, it's not really what you clicked on this video for. So let's try to get back on topic. And by that, I mean, have you all heard of Neon Genesis Evangelion? Well, you see, it's a mech anime with a lot of connections to Sailor Moon, with one of the most notable being Hideaki Anno's involvement in the series, as he provided key animation for Uranus and Neptune's transformation sequence. According to internet lore, he was paid in animation stills of his favorite Sailor Moon waifu. I have literally no legitimate source on that, other than some old forum posts. But what I do know as a fact is he was instrumental in granting the cousin sailors their own proper transformation sequence, since allegedly they weren't going to receive one. Anno even fought to have it extended from the 15 seconds to a full 40-second transformation sequence, which we, never got. Shafted again, Outer Senshi. Shafted again. And finally, at least for this part of the iceberg, I'm just gonna touch upon the fact that the Amazonas Quartet are all Sailor Senshi. It's kinda odd, I often forget about this fact, but they're supposed to be Chibiusa's bodyguards in the future. This isn't even addressed in the original anime, but with the release of Eternal, I suppose this information will no longer be as obscured. Moving down deeper into the iceberg, we start off with a real doozy. While this is technically two separate entries, the theming and the timey-wimey shenanigans about to go down kind of put them together. So I'm gonna start with the less complicated one, and that is the possibility that there is multiple Chibiusa. Chibiusai? Chibiusas? Chibi... Look, there's a lot of them. There's at least two Chibiusa within the continuity of the story. There's the Chibiusa we see, and the Chibiusa that has yet to be born. In an unaltered timeline, they would be one and the same. Yet, we don't witness an unaltered timeline. So I have to posit the question, how many small ladies are there? And for the sake of simplicity, we're not adding the movies to this discussion, because that's like 3 more Chibiusa right there. So let's start off with the first Chibiusa. The Black Moon arc Chibiusa, who comes from Crystal Tokyo in the 30th century, a future where the rest of the series never occurs. See, that's the problem with writing time travel as your second major story beat. If you have yet to fully flesh out all your lore, it means the stories you have yet to create have never occurred. That means all the Sailor Senshi essentially plateau in power. The Dark Kingdom arc occurs, and that's pretty much it for that timeline. We see the story unfold, and Chibiusa goes back to her timeline, only to immediately reappear. But this is a completely different Chibiusa, who is from a different timeline where the Dark Kingdom and Black Moon arc have occurred. This is due to the fact that Chibiusa doesn't know who the Outer Senshi are, and it would be kinda fucked up if Neo Queen Serenity sent her daughter willingly into the events of the Infinity arc. But why do I say that this Chibiusa is different than the previous one? This Chibiusa knows of a certain MacGuffin that would have helped immensely in the previous story arc. So we can assume that the Holy Grail did not exist in the other timeline. And this Chibiusa is also slightly older. The whole being 900 thing isn't really addressed in the Infinity arc. So I like to think that this Chibiusa isn't actually 900. But that could just be my memory messing with me. So at the end of the day, we have about 3 Chibiusa. And if you thought that was confusing, just hold on. Because Sailor Pluto's about to take confusing to a whole new level. We're talking multiple Sailor Plutos existing concurrently at the same time here. So as you all know, Sailor Pluto is introduced in the Black Moon arc, where she ends up failing at her job and dying. But it is implied that she's been standing at the gate the entire time since at least the first Silver Millennium, as it was Queen Serenity who had assigned her to the position. And after the fall of the Moon Kingdom, it's kind of fuzzy if she was killed or not. It makes very little sense for her to have been killed and reincarnated due to the time gate still needing a proper protector, unless she paradoxically lived and died at the same time, which I'm going to propose that she did. The time gate still needs a protector, but Sailor Saturn's pretty good at killing everything. So when the Moon Kingdom fell, Sailor Pluto died along with the rest, but due to being outside the realm of space and time, simply didn't feel its effect, thus allowing her and Setsuna to exist at the same time, as she reincarnated with everyone else. Otherwise, Setsuna would have been remarkably younger than the rest of the cast. So by the time the Infinity Arc starts, we have two Sailor Plutos existing concurrently at the same time, one guarding the time door, and the other palling around with Uranus and Neptune. But what if I told you there's another? The two Sailor Pluto that I have talked about are fairly easy to see within the continuity of the story, even if you don't realize that they are two separate people. Yet this third one flew completely off of my radar, and I literally just reread the manga. But to be fair, the Sailor Stars arc is a mess. So when Chibiusa returns to the future, the Pluto that she spies on is a completely different Pluto, as this Pluto is in her super form, whereas the Pluto protecting the door died before achieving this form, and Setsuna had already achieved Eternal during the Dream Arc. However, the most likely explanation for this third Pluto is Naoko simply forgot. Considering Pluto is probably the least represented in Sailor Senshi, can you really blame her? Don't at me, Pluto stans. Following that somewhat long-winded explanation, we move on to a much simpler topic. Thank the moon. Which is, what are the Sailor Senshi, in the literal sense? You see, if you're old like me, you grew up with the translation of Sailor Scout, which is an interesting interpretation. A change that I'd chalk up to easy branding for children. Sailor Scout has alliteration and is far more marketable than Sailor Soldier, but none of the Senshi really scout anything, so now we're left with the Soldier versus Guardian debate. Well, it's not so much a debate, with Soldier being a pretty apt term to describe the word Senshi. So why does everything say pretty Guardian? Sailor Moon. Is this another case of Soldier sounding too scary to market, or is there more to this? Remember a few moments ago when I said we're moving on to a more simple topic? I lied. I hope everybody watching is an expert in Japanese copyright law. And while the copyright history of Sailor Moon is a topic I'll cover later, it seems that the change from Soldier to Guardian was a deliberate one. A change that most fans, myself included, don't care for. But like I said, this was an intentional change. What if I told you that this change was at the behest of Naoko Takeuchi herself, as this change seemingly occurred sometime after she acquired the broadcasting rights to the series, and the change was made by a company owned by her. And while it seems that the poor Sailor Senshi are forever stuck as guardians, it's slightly better knowing that Miss Takeuchi herself made that judgment call, and it wasn't some studio executive pulling a filthy axe at a reasonable price. I'll talk about Bao one of these days, I swear. And now for something completely different. Kosagi Tsukino is a name most fans are not intimately familiar with. It has all the trappings of a familiar name, but falls fundamentally short, or too long, I guess. She only ever appears within the side story Parallel Sailor Moon, and the whole experience isn't really lucid. It's about 20 pages long, and while I wouldn't claim it to be a good read, for a one-shot in an alternate universe, it's whatever. And I believe it's Naoko's last attempt at an original story within the Sailor Moon universe, which has probably earned it some undeserved hate. Probably due to fans expecting something a bit more. But a quick rundown for those of you not in the know-how. At an undisclosed point within the future, all the inner senshi are married and have children, who look and are named exactly the same. So nothing new to remember. Except that is, of course, Kosagi, who is Usagi and Mamoru's second child, who's introduced about 5 pages in, as the beginning of the story is pretty much catch up with the characters we actually know. A sort of where are they now type thing, except they're not, since this is an alternate universe and none of that matters. Did I mention this one-shot's divisive? So, all the daughters of the Senshi don't want to hang out with Kosagi. They find her to be annoying, which I guess is kind of meta, since she acts exactly like her mother. So, the other girls try to ditch her and she meets a pink cat. Then a giant meteorite or UFO appears in the sky. The cat tells Kosagi she has to save the planet. She learns the transformation phrase, parallel moon power makeup, which naturally transforms her and the rest of the girls into Sailor Senshi. The giant meteorite is revealed to be it's a bunch of rabbits. A big ball of space rabbits. So naturally, Kosagi uses her cat manipulation powers and just spawns a shit ton of cats out of nowhere. But as the notorious B.I.G. once said, it was all a dream. I think actually one of the best parts of this entire one-shot is Haruka and Michiro are actually cooking teachers for 3rd graders, and it's adorable. I guess Satsuna's there too. But there's a really cute shot of Michiro freaking out about the girls sleeping, and Haruka's just like holding a muffin, and the expression on her face is just, you're scaring the children, honey. I don't know, you gotta take the good where you can get it. And that's pretty much the gist of Parallel Sailor Moon. And I'd say there's a handful of reasons why it's not very well liked. The vagueness of the canonicity of the story is always going to be a point of contention. Like, I believe the story introduces itself as July 1999, in a certain universe at a certain time, at a certain planet, certain things happened. And the it was all a dream ending just rubs people the wrong way. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe this was Naoko Takeuchi's last manga within the Sailor Moon universe. And this was like 2 years after the original run ended, so people clearly wanted more. Sorry to tell you 1999, but we're still waiting. But speaking of parallel universes, let's talk about Cyborg Sailor Mercury. Now, evidently this was a really early design concept, but Naoko wanted Sailor Mercury to be a cyborg. And some of this kind of carried over into the actual character Sailor Mercury. After all, Ame is the brains of the operation and great with computers, which in the 90s meant you're some whiz kid or part robot. Probably both. Naoko even planned on killing her off by removing her limbs, but evidently her editor objected to this, and Ame never turned into a cyborg. But most people can agree that would be way too ridiculous for Sailor Moon. I mean, can you imagine a cute, timid, short-haired girl who's actually part robot in Sailor Moon of all things? Get real. Yeah, I'm pretty sure once Naoko had more creative leeway, she repurposed this entire idea into Hotaru, who, ironically enough, also lost all of her cyborg traits. Speaking of characters with altered traits, let's talk about the Sailor Starlights. And what's so controversial about them, you may ask? After all, they're just a group of Sailor Senshi who are looking for their lost princess, under the guise of the pop band The Three Lights, which, in hindsight, kind of gives their identity away. But don't worry, the Three Lights are comprised entirely of men, and Galaxia is a total boomer and doesn't listen to anything newer than the 1970s. So where does the controversy lie? Honestly, if you haven't pieced it together yet, I'm not even going to address the rampant censorship that went on with them. And no, they were not the reason the 5th season never got dubbed. Toei didn't want to sell, and people didn't buy enough Pop-Tarts. No, the Sailor Starlight controversy is actually not related to censorship at all. I'm actually referring to the fact that Naoko Takeuchi herself did not like the anime adaptation of the Starlights. For you see, there's actually a distinct difference between the manga and anime counterparts. In the manga, the Starlights are merely pretending to be men, cross-dressing to hide their identities. Whereas in the anime, they quite literally turn into men, and back again when they need to be Sailor Senshi. And that's been a key difference that Naoko never liked. And the sparse few instances we have of her talking about it, she usually says she was upset by the choice, as she has always been very vocal about the fact that Sailor Senshi can only be women, with the slight exception of Mamoru, as she breaks that rule with the whole Golden Crystal Sailor Earth debacle. Hence the controversy. Can Sailor Senshi only be women? Is the anime the correct continuity, or is the manga? As a purist, I would always say, whatever the author envisions is the end-all be-all, and thus the manga continuity would have to be the correct one. But ever since Sailor Moon's inception, the anime and the manga have always gone hand in hand. If it wasn't for Toei's involvement, the story would have never gone on, past the events of the Dark Kingdom arc. And while I'm currently having a hard time finding exactly how far apart the manga and the anime were at this time, I can definitively say the manga did come first in this instance. So I suppose the better question would be, why the change? And to that end, I can't really give a legitimate answer. I haven't seen or read any interviews with Ryota Yamaguchi on the matter, and I really don't have any solid theories on it. The most I could really glean is some pragmatist just thought that transforming them into literal men would disguise their voice better. I know it's kind of a blah answer, but it's the Sailor Starlights. We don't have a lot to work with. And if that interview is out there, I have a 4-year-old's understanding of the Japanese language anyhow. I even tried to find some possible justification within their alleged mythological backgrounds. And I'll admit the alleged Hindu Trimurti tie-in is loose. Using that as possible justification just falls flat on its face, as there's many examples of mythological men being women for the purposes of the series. Perhaps you could make an argument that for every male Hindu deity there is a female consort and or equivalent, thus explaining the interchanging nature of the Sailor Starlights, but the whole Sailor Starlight to Hindu Trimurti parallels are weak, with Star Maker, Healer, and Fighter loosely having similar titles to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But I would say that theory is just fans trying to insert a square peg into a round hole. It doesn't hold up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. And so I must conclude that the whole gender controversy just stemmed from one person thinking that it made more sense for them to be men. So with that odd, messy controversy out of the way, I want to talk about a litany of other odd, controversial messes that is the Sailor Moon copyright. Now, to go through and explain all the nuance with the copyright would take an immense amount of time, and I have a rather good hunch that this video will be close to an hour long, so I'll keep my meandering to a minimum and keep this nice and brief. For those of you who don't know, Sailor Moon was not conceived of as an artistic endeavor, but rather a marketable one. And while that can be said of any anime or manga, after all, they are created to sell, let's just say there's a lot of heavy hitters hugely invested from inception on this one. We're talking two of Japan's biggest media empires, and one of the largest and most profitable toy companies worldwide. We're talking Kodansha, Toei, and Bandai, respectively. And while none of them could have imagined the explosive success Sailor Moon would go on to achieve, let's just say all of them knew of the vast untapped potential that the young girl demographic could feasibly achieve. And interestingly enough, while there was a lot of money being thrown at the project, there wasn't very many cooks in the kitchen. Sure, Naoko had to answer to Fumio Asano, her longtime editor, for those of you who don't know. And of course, Toei would need to know what was happening within the story months in advance. And even Bandai had influence throughout the entirety of the series. Fun factoid on that one, all the Sailor Starlights have ponytails due to Bandai's intervention, as it was popular with dolls at the time. What honestly surprises me the most about this massive multimedia effort is that all parties involved envisioned Sailor Moon being a single arc long, which makes the whole proposition feel more of a loose conglomerated effort than an entire multimedia media, consumer extravaganza shitfest that we're used to in this day and age. But the one thing that always remains an absolute shitfest is copyright. And when you have so many big players involved from the beginning, coupled with the surprise, runaway success of a series, you have to wonder who's getting screwed, especially as the series becomes more and more profitable. So while Bandai is involved in alterations from existing designs, their creative input on the series is more limited. So when the fight for rights breaks out, Bandai's not gonna have a stake. They'd more or less want to appease whoever wins out. Although, fun fact, Bandai does own Cowboy Bebop. At the same time, we can also rule Kodansha out, as they still own the manga license. And being a publisher that go through almost a revolving door of creators, it's far easier to let an individual tell their story than hire somebody to work on an existing one, as you open yourself up to a lot more litigation that way. Just look at the American comic industry. So in short, Kodansha just publishes Takeuchi's work without getting their hands dirty. So that leaves us with one of the major players, Toei Animation, who by the end of the Dark Kingdom arc had already created a multitude of monster girls. Hell, they were even gearing up for their own arc. Pun intended. And by the end of it all, they had a handful of original movies, characters, monsters, not to mention all the original music, animation, and storylines that you tend to acquire over years of producing an anime, especially with how fast and loose Sailor Moon was created. Toei seems to have taken great pride within the franchise, and if you take the alleged quote by famed Sailor Moon director Ikuhara to heart, well, it paints a rather vivid picture. The quote I'm referring to is this: Sailor Moon would have been better off without Naoko Takeuchi's original manga, quote unquote. I mean, the man did simp for Rei so hard he completely changed her character within the anime. And people think I'm extreme for wanting Codename Sailor V animated. Start the petition. So there is clearly some sort of beef between Takeuchi and Toei at the time. The quote coming out about a year after the animation ended. But to answer the question I posited earlier, who was getting screwed, whenever 3 multi-million-dollar corporations are involved in your project, it's probably going to be you. And with the bad blood between Toei and Takeuchi in place, I believe you can put 2 and 2 together as to who is getting the raw end of the deal. Although as far as getting screwed over by these massive multi-million-dollar companies go, Naoko had it off pretty easy. Her disagreement with Toei was strictly over royalties, and she couldn't have been getting screwed over that badly because she ended up purchasing the broadcasting rights. And the bad blood couldn't have been all too bad due to Toei producing Crystal years down the line. And furthermore, Naoko ended up creating her own company called PNP, Princess Naoko Planning, who seemed to take care of the ownership of the rights for her. I believe the company kind of functions similarly to the Tolkien estate, but I really can't find much on them. Well, I just spent the last 5 minutes discussing copyright. Let's go further down the iceberg, shall we? So now we're officially entering the darker depths of the iceberg. And in layman terms, that means the memes. And while there's certainly more joke entries in this part of the list and the next part, there's still some legitimate discussion to be had. Such as the fact that Pharaoh 90 is still technically alive. At least within the manga's continuity. If your only experience with the series is through the anime, you may recall him being mortally wounded, then being entered by Super Sailor Moon and the newly awakened Sailor Saturn. What a lucky guy. Hell, he was even killed within the events of Crystal, where upon Sailor Saturn's awakening, he realizes death is at hand and begs to die in his home in the Tau Nebula, which for some reason he gets sent to. But in the manga, he's never mortally wounded, just severely injured. I know it's semantics, but he's a giant planet demon thing. So technically, he just retreats back to the Tau Nebula to never be seen again, meaning he's technically still out there. Granted, with no means to ever interact with the main cast again, but still out there. So I like VTubers quite a bit. They tend to be quite entertaining, and you really don't know who they are behind the animated avatar. But what if I told you their purpose wasn't to entertain, but to adopt a fake identity and kill their Sailor Senshi, all at the behest of Sailor Galaxia? For I have found conclusive proof that the Sailor Animites have rebranded under the new name of V Shoujo. Alright, honestly, I came up with this stupid idea because of the one sailor anima mate, or however you pronounce it, is named Iron Mouse. And to my knowledge, nobody's ever asked the VTuber Iron Mouse if they're related. So I'm just gonna assume they haven't found the legendary silver crystal yet. Now I'm not quite sure what being a VTuber has to do with killing the Sailor Senshi, but this fanfiction's not gonna write itself. So now that I planted that seed in your mind, let's continue on. Who knows, maybe if I get bored and learn how to successfully pronounce anima mates, I might make a video assigning a VTuber to each one of them. Pretty cringe, I know. Or maybe a fake expose tying them up to Sailor Galaxia, I really don't know. So moving on, we're gonna be discussing some obscure Sailor Moon characters. Namely Sailor Gucci and Sailor Chanel. It's that JoJo crossover we always wanted. These two characters only ever appear once, which is more times than I've made reference to Sailor Jupiter. And they appear within Chibi Usa's picture diary number 4, which would later be retitled The Secret of the Hammer Price Haul, and it originally ran in Run Run magazine. Sorry for the pun. Which was home to codename Sailor V for a time. Yet the canonicity of the story is questionable at its best. It's a relatively short and innocuous story about the adventures of Chibi Moon Hataro, Naruru Osaka, and Ruruna Kobe. And to the inquisitive listener, it should be rather apparent that the two names you don't recognize are Sailor Gucci and Sailor Chanel, respectively. Although they're never actually referred to as such, as they are not actual Sailor Senshi. And corporations have yet to gain the ability to name major planetary bodies. And can I just go on record and say, their Sailor Senshi outfits are absolutely ridiculous. Keep in mind that they are canonically the same age as Chibiusa and Hotaru. That's right, they're 10. Although, fun fact, Naruru is actually Naru Osaka's little sister. She gets a Sailor transformation before her sister, with less than a fraction of the screen time. The world is a cruel place. Speaking of things that may or may not have happened, the Black Moon arc is one such instance. At least, not within this timeline. I've wasted quite a bit of time discussing time wibbly-wobbly nonsense. But if you look at the entirety of the story as we know it now, the events of the Black Moon arc could never have happened, due to the arc relying upon events that can no longer happen. As within our main continuity, Usagi has staved off the world from Chaos's influence, which in turn means no wise man. Let's say for the sake of argument that the Black Moon arc takes place far enough into the future that Chaos has returned in some way, shape, or form. Usagi now knows the exact time and date in which the attack is going to occur. That puts her into a crystal coma. Her, along with the rest of the Sailor Senshi, are immensely more powerful than they were within that story arc. Granted, Usagi probably isn't studious enough to remember such a date or time, but literally everybody else around her would remember. Hell, she'd probably be the only one caught off guard. So while the events of the Black Moon arc did indeed occur, they can never reoccur. Which means that you can go visit beautiful Crystal Tokyo without ever having to worry about the Sailor Moon equivalent of 9/11. Moving on, I just wanted to address a odd little tidbit I discovered, which is the references to Naoko's other works within Sailor Moon. It's actually a rather innocuous thing, a lot of authors do it. But the thing that I find strange with Sailor Moon in particular is within the reprints, they remove most of the references, such as Ame Mizuno looking like Rina Kirimitsu from Naoko Takeuchi's one-off manga Miss Rain, which, oddly enough, Usagi points out upon meeting her. That is, before the year 2003 when this reference was removed. And perhaps this is just my memory playing tricks on me, but I distinctly remember all the manga Usagi used to read used to be Naoko's other works, but were replaced with Sailor V. Although maybe that's some sort of Mandela effect. Maybe this really is the universe where the Black Moon arc happens. So here we are at the lowest level of the iceberg. And if we stay too long in these dark depths, surely these insane theories will start to sound sane. Starting this descent into madness, we have the fact that Greco-Roman mythology is merely Sailor Moon fanfiction. At least within the Sailor Moon universe. When you think about it, the Sailor Moon universe is almost exactly the same as ours. Japan as a nation exists, thus grounding it within our own reality. The only true difference being the existence of the Silver Millennium. So the question then becomes, when did the Moon Kingdom collapse? Because with the end of the Silver Millennium and the destruction of the Moon Kingdom, our observable history would begin. If I recall correctly, the original dub stated that the Silver Millennium happened over 1,000 years ago. So if for some reason you think that the Silver Millennium happened more modernly, that would be it. But the manga and Crystal do state that it happened prehistorically, which is strange to say the least. So obviously that would place the Silver Millennium at the beginning of our timeline, which is to say before the creation of the Greek and Roman empires. When you look at it that way, all their stories and myths are merely the adventures of the Sailor Senshi that we never got to see play out. A lot of these strange creatures within their mythology, perhaps those are precursors to the Dark Kingdom's Yoma, or perhaps that was Queen Metalia's first attempts. You ever notice how Roman soldiers tend to dress like Sailor Senshi? Their culture was very clearly based off of that of the Moon Kingdom. And of course we have the obvious. All their gods and goddesses are named after key figures within the Moon Kingdom. Obviously with some gender bending, probably to hide from Sailor Galaxia. I'm joking about that bit. Everything about this theory seems to line up, except for the fact that Sailor Saturn killed absolutely everybody who would have known about the Moon Kingdom. However, it's never stated if she destroyed the remnants of Elysion, where these stories could have been written down. I mean, the one time we see the thing, it doesn't look too good for wear, but the kingdom did allegedly span the entire Earth. Was this all intended? No. Am I grasping at straws? Yes. But I think it's kind of a funny theory. Moving on, I wanted to discuss the notion that the secondary antagonists are the real threat. Who are the secondary antagonists I'm referring to? Well, it would be the second big bad of every arc. Queen Beryl, Prince Damond, even Dr. Tomoe. And while there is no secondary antagonist in the Dream arc, there is one within Stars, which will tie into this theory. So essentially what we're looking at is that all the secondary antagonists are the real threats. And this is because the primary antagonist is merely a form of chaos, who merely fed into their evil, thus making the secondary antagonists the actual catalyst for the story. And when that catalyst dies, you'll notice that is when chaos tends to get unhinged, wildly and rapidly trying to consume everything in darkness, without much tact or strategy. While this particular idea can be argued against in the case of Prince Damond, and to an extent Dr. Tomoe, it's pretty much confirmed with Queen Beryl and Sailor Galaxia, as both were directly swayed by the powers of chaos. But there is enough exceptions to the rule that I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Moving on to a theory with much more substance behind it, Naru is chaos. I, like many people who grew up watching the anime, thought that Naru was meant for more. It seems like they put a lot of work into developing her character, giving her tons of screen time and character development for it to ultimately go nowhere. And not to mention she's always getting attacked. And with that heavy Brooklyn accent, who could blame them? But what if I told you her damsel in distress act was just that, and she is actually the living embodiment of chaos? This is some game theory level shit, I can't keep going. How about something with more meat to its bones that I didn't just make up? Mamoru is Setsuna. Yes, you heard me right. A, I didn't make this theory up, and B, it makes more sense than Naru being chaos. So this is actually an ancient meme. Hell, it's probably a bit older than I am. But believers in this theory think that Setsuna is just Mamoru in drag, which, granted, if you look at the two of them, they look kinda similar. Supporters of this theory state that any differences are just the use of cosmetics. I guess that puts a whole new twist on Pluto planet power makeup, but the theory gets weirder, because not only are they the same exact person, but Chibi Usa is their daughter. Make of that one as you will. I don't know why I've always loved this stupid theory. It's like super easy to debunk, but the amount of shit you used to be able to start with it within the community, it's just mwah, perfect little chef kiss. Yes, I'm a grown man talking about Sailor Moon. Of course I don't know what a kiss sounds like. Let's just wrap this thing up. And Sadly, this pertains to the future of the series. Are there any real plans for a continuation? As another 90s baby's first anime, Dragon Ball has recently entered a renaissance. And while you can argue the quality of the story, there's no argument that it's back in full force. So what are the chances of a series continuation, a la Dragon Ball Super? Pretty much none, because we already had Sailor Moon Super. Bad jokes aside, I ultimately think that decision's up to Naoko. And given her past experience with the anime industry, that's a coin toss if she even wants to get involved. And while she does own a big chunk of the rights to the property, I see her being far more hesitant than Toriyama was. The series was also tied up pretty well. Chaos, who influenced all the villains, was defeated. And while I think you could tell a perfectly fine story with Chibiusa, for instance, with her Sailor Senshi, you would have to have a very talented writer come in and establish a whole swath of new lore, new story elements, characters and premise, along with an antagonistic force not tied to Chaos, all without contradicting previously established lore. Not to say it can't be done, but it would take a stroke of genius. And if it doesn't come from Naoko herself, I believe fans would have a hard time buying into it. Well, there you go, that is my Sailor Moon Iceberg. I honestly had a lot of fun working on this and researching it. I obviously grew up with Sailor Moon and I'm a big fan. There was sadly some ideas I had to leave on the cutting room floor. Ideas that would take too long to expand upon, longer than some of the more lengthy segments I had. I originally had one segment about Moonlight Densetsu, possibly being plagiarized, and I had a super long segment about the Infinity Arc symbolism, where I talked about the possible origins of Pharaoh 90 and Mistress 9 for like 15 minutes. And while I plan on keeping my channel with a whole bunch of variety, I think you can expect some Sailor Moon content in the future. Well, if you got this far, let me know if you want me to do anything in particular next. Peace out.
Oh, yeah.